Well, thank you, Shmuel, and thank you to the organizers for having me out. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give two talks. These talks are some distillation of my perspective on methodology from what I think of as geometric data analysis for thinking about genomic data very broadly. And data from cancer is one kind of application, but I'll say not so much about cancer and lots about math. So what I want to start with is, and just to say something about who I am, I don't know if people know me particularly, or why you would, but I think of myself as an internal skeptic in this kind of stuff. Like I would dearly, so I believe as a religious matter that geometric ideas have things to tell us about data, that scientific and clinical inference can be done using geometric invariance. And I would very much like this to be true. From my perspective, there is a lack of miracles, if you will, in the subject. And so what I want to try to talk about is something about sort of realistic uses of geometry in data analysis. And so the two things I'm going to talk a little bit about are optimal transport and matching in the first talk, and in the second talk, some idiosyncratic view of things happening in manifold learning. Okay? But let me talk about optimal transport and matching first. And I just want to take you through how it works. But to start, like, what is the slogan? The idea for all of this is that matching is a primitive operation that you want to do ubiquitously when analyzing data. And kinds of examples that come up in, very generally, but certainly in genomic data, are things like alignment. You have data sets that come from the same tissue and different technologies. And you want to align them and combine them somehow. You have multiple recordings of something with slightly different systematic biases, and they're translated and rotated from one another. You want to combine them. You have to match them somehow. You have transfer of structure across data sets. For instance, one application I'll talk about in a little bit at the end, you have cell type labels in a data set, and now you have a new data set where you think those cell type labels, there might be correlates. How do you match the points to transfer cell type label information? Time series. If you do single cell data, you can record, for instance, in a developmental process, you can record every 6 hours as stem cells are becoming things. As you know, when you do this, you kill the cells, right? You'd love to track a particular cell through its life cycle. This you cannot do. But you can try to track populations and align them using some kind of matching. Finally, you might want to average data sets. If you think you have a bunch of measurements, you might want a most representative data set, a centroid or something like this. This also you can pose as a matching problem. So these are all problems that have a very similar flavor, although the specific applications are different, and I want to talk about how to do this. And from a mathematical perspective, I guess before I start talking about the Hausdorff distance, from a mathematical perspective, what you are doing is trying to put a metric, a distance, on data sets. That's what this is about. And I want to start by, when I say data set, what I'm going to mean is finite metric space. So it's a bunch of points and a distance that satisfies the triangle inequality. You can think of this as a subset of Rn for large N, which came from taking single cell mRNA-seq recording, right? That's a canonical example, but there are lots of others. It doesn't matter. And now you want to say, how do you put a metric on this? And so the first thing we're going to do is think about something a little bit weaker, which is called the Hausdorff distance. And the idea here is that you have a metric space, and I have two subspaces inside it. And I want to know what's the distance between them. And the answer is pretty simple. I blow them each up. I take the smallest number epsilon so that if I fatten one of them and fatten the other, they engulf each other. Okay, and that's what this formula is. And you can write this as a kind of minimax problem. And it turns out, I'm going to prove nothing and make lots of assertions, but this is a relatively easy one to check. It turns out that this actually is a metric. Not 100% obvious, but true. And one other thing to say, I'm going to be pretty cavalier about the hypotheses under which various things are true. For this to make sense, I think that should be closed subsets probably, and you might need a little bit about your metric space so that it's not to rule out really perverted examples. I'm going to not say that stuff, just, if you care, I can try to remember, but probably you don't. So here's a picture of the Hausdorff distance. Here we're blowing up a ball, something around the blue points, and we're blowing up something around the red points, and they're supposed to engulf each other, and the smallest epsilon that does that, that's the Hausdorff distance. Now, that's good. And now we want to turn that into a metric on arbitrary metric spaces. The Hausdorff distance, you got to be subspaces of something. And so you do this crazy thing. Right? This part sounds nuts, especially if you haven't heard this before. You take the min, or the inf really, over all metric spaces in which our two data sets could possibly embed of the Hausdorff distance. You embed them. Now they're subspaces of something bigger, and you take the Hausdorff distance. Now what is this doing? What this is doing, I would like to find props. If you are matching this release and this piece of tinfoil, if you put them over here, the Hausdorff distance is big. If I move them like this, the Hausdorff distance is smaller. If I move them like this, the Hausdorff distance is smaller yet. And so the idea here is that these isometric embeddings, you should think of these, in the case of physical objects, you can think of these as like rigid transformations that are trying to overlap these things. And then we're going to take the smallest distance. Okay, so that's why this is a sensible thing to do. You're getting rid of, isometries are more general than rigid transformations, but that's the kind of thing you're doing. And again, this is an idea due to Gromov, and it turns out that this is a metric on isometry classes of compact metric spaces. So if you rename the points, right, that's not the same metric space, but you can't see the difference with this. This is another thing I'm not going to belabor, and I will just refer to this as a metric. Now, this is a crazy formulation. Right? This is in principle not computable. And there are small and big infinities, and sort of the set of all possible isometric embeddings into some metric space, that's a big infinity. So this is not something as formulated that you might hope to compute. But it is a metric, which is interesting. But I want to reformulate this in a way that makes more sense, that you might actually have some hope of computing it. And to do this, I want to talk about relations. Now, a relation, you should think matching at this point. We now get to the thing in the slogan. A relation, it's a subset. You want to pair up two spaces x and y. It's a subset of x cross y, where you require that for every person in x, there's at least one person they're matched with in y. For every person in y, there's at least one person they're matched with in x. Could be a perfect matching. Doesn't have to be. You could have multiple things matched. You just have to have everybody go somewhere. Okay, so there are lots of relations, but one thing you notice that will be useful later is that if I want to specify a relation, it's a table. For every pair x and y, I have a bit. Yes, it's in the relation. No, it's not in the relation. And so if I'm dealing with finite metric spaces, which if I'm dealing with data, I am, this is a finite thing. And now maybe we can hope to compute it. Because the point is, first, that you can describe, for any given relation, you can describe the distortion of the relation. And that is the soup. It's the worst discrepancy between points, where I match x and y, I match x prime and y prime. And if I had this relation was really doing a nice matching, the distance between x and x prime, if they're matched to y and y prime, those distances ought to be the same. And if they're not, that's a measure of how bad this matching is. And so this distortion, it's the worst pair for this kind of measurement. You take the absolute value of this difference of the distances. And it's a theorem, not obvious, that the Gromov-Hausdorff distance, in fact, is 1/2 times the best distortion. Okay? And this now you could hope to compute. Kind of. So one observation, and I'll say something a little bit more precise about this in a second, is that if you think about it, this is an integer programming problem. And integer programming problems are NP hard. So we know you can do it, but it's hard. Now, one thing to say before I start talking about computing it, another way to think about what this is doing. So when you have a distance, what does it let you do? It lets you talk about convergence. And why do we care about convergence here? Because we're going to be interested in things like laws of large numbers. If you take bigger and bigger finite samples, they should get closer and closer. And I'll say that's true, and I'll explain how that's true. But one thing to say is that converging in the Gromov-Hausdorff distance, it's like converging for every finite distance matrix. If you take a set of points and you take the matrix of pairwise distances, those matrices converge. And what this tells you sort of is what the juice that this is seeing is basically what's captured in the distances. Now, one thing to say is that this kind of convergence, it's very interesting to think about what it means geometrically. And you can ask what kinds of geometric properties are preserved. One that is not preserved is the existence of cusps and singularities. So you can think about having sort of this rounded cone, and you can construct a series of these things that converge in the Gromov-Hausdorff metric to something with a point. Okay, so smoothness is not really preserved by this, but there are geometric properties that are, as we'll see. Okay, so let me say something about the law of large numbers. So for this, I need to introduce the notion of an epsilon net. And this is a precise way of talking about a metric approximation. So an epsilon net, it's a subset such that every point is with an epsilon of something in the subset. Okay? And the interesting case, I mean, obviously you can, if you take an infinite epsilon net, this is, maybe interesting. But the interesting case for our purposes is that for compact things, so compact just kind of means bounded, basically, you can take finite epsilon nets that converge in the Gromov-Hausdorff distance. You take bigger and bigger things. And how do you do this? You sort of, you can do this by taking a point and taking a point as far away as possible and taking another point that's far away from it. And you just keep doing it until the distances between them are less than epsilon, basically. Okay? And so you can always do this. And this is good. This is a sort of a sanity check because, many of the theorems in geometric data analysis have very little to do with practice, except insofar as they give you sanity checks, right? This is saying, and the other things I'm going to say, amount to saying it is sensible to study these infinite underlying processes that we imagine are there in terms of finite samples. And this is a way of getting at that. Yes?
So just to gauge, so this says there exists something, but you're not imposing for now any kind of probabilistic thing.
No.
You have a random process with some high probability.
Yes, so this is a good point. So what I'm talking about right now, what we all have in mind, I think whether you know it or not, is that these finite samples were drawn from some measure. I'm going to talk about metric measure spaces in 4 slides. So, hang out. But yes, right now there's no sampling. But that's when you sample, of course, if you sample IID from some sensible measure, then again, what the law of large numbers really is going to say is that's going to be an epsilon net with high probability, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so in fact, 1 slide. Good question. So we imagine always that these finite metric spaces we're dealing with are samples. And the picture, and again, I want to emphasize, these pictures lead us in the direction of religious beliefs that might be bad, right? And what I mean by that is that as soon as I start saying things like, I don't know about you, but as soon as I start saying things like this, I start thinking these points are sampled from a compact Riemannian manifold. And, I do not, if I really stop to think about it, I do not believe that genomic data lies on a manifold.
No manifold hypothesis.
Yeah, I don't believe the manifold hypothesis in this context. I think it's wrong. And I think there's an extremely interesting series of questions about, on the one hand, I think it's wrong. On the other hand, there's obviously geometry. And so the question is, what geometry is there? And, I can free associate about that at some point, but let me just say that right now. Anyway, so we imagine that we have this finite sample, and it's got to come from this underlying continuous space. And so we're going to talk about equipping the space with a measure so that we can sample from it. Okay, so what's a metric measure space? It's, you have the metric, and now we have a measure. And it's what, I'm not going to review measure theory in any real way, obviously. This is what's called a Borel measure. And all that means is that, so when you have a measure, it says which things have area, which subsets have area, right? That's what this is about. And, your first thought maybe is that basically all subsets should have area. And that sounds very reasonable until you start asking questions like, well, what about the Cantor set? Does that have area? What about a space-filling curve? What's the area of that? And so when you define a measure, you do it in the context of stipulating which sets can have area and which can't. And the ones that can't don't concern us because they'll never arise from experimental data. But it's a feature of the theory. So you have this measure, and the measure is sort of subordinated to the metric in the sense that the things that have to have areas are the balls, and the unions of the balls, and the intersections of the balls. And that's what this means. Okay, and so the sort of most important example from our perspective, or one of them, is the empirical measure on a sample. Right? You take a sample and you assign every point the same probability. Okay? And but here are some other examples. The empirical measure, you can give any, the sphere, you can give the uniform measure on it. You can think any Riemannian manifold, I'll say a little bit more about this later, who has the volume measure, which is a notion of uniform sampling. And there are other sorts of examples. So we now want to upgrade the Gromov-Hausdorff distance to a metric on metric measure spaces. And I want to do this. There's sort of three ways to think about where this comes from, which are, I was going to say in tension, but they're really not. They're sort of complementary. One way is that intrinsically, you would like a measure on metric measure spaces, and something that's related to probability theory, just as a first principle. That's one. Two, it turns out, and I'll say this, that we can't compute integer programs. And if you have spent any time around optimization, the first thing you would think is, well, let's relax it to a real program. If you do that, what you get is a metric, the same thing that we'll get sort of by first principles, a metric on metric measure spaces. And there's another reason to want this, which is that as soon as you think about this as a relaxation, this is something you really can compute. Integer programs, the best solvers that I know of, and this is as of a couple of years ago for Gromov-Hausdorff distance, are like 150 points. And let's assume that I'm out of touch and it's really 300 points, but come on. So this is computationally effective. And so we're going to have two variants, same two-step process. First, we're going to put a metric on measures on a fixed metric space, and then we're going to do the same Gromov trick to extend it to arbitrary metric measure spaces. Okay. So first we have the Wasserstein distance, and we have to replace our notion of a relation. And so how do we do that? Well, we have what's called a coupling. And a coupling, you should think of this explicitly as a sort of probabilistic matching. Okay? And specifically what it is it's a measure, in this case it's a measure on the Cartesian product of our metric space with itself, such that if you integrate out on either side, you get your pair of distributions. Okay? You can think of this, I didn't write it this way, but there are projections from z cross z to z, and these are the push-forward distributions. They're pi1 and pi2. And now the Wasserstein distance we define as the inf over all couplings. You take the best matching, and you integrate the distance between points x and y over that matching. And this comes up in the computer science literature as something called the earth movers distance, where what you should think of this is a loss function that is penalizing turning one distribution into the other according to how much probability mass you had to move and how far you had to move it. And so, there are pictures of this in terms of sand. Yes?
So it's a stupid question, I'm sorry. So in this abstract setup, usually I think of a function that gives me the right thing, not an abstract relationship, which would be many to one and all that. So is this really the same as the standard Wasserstein distance, the way that I'm using it?
It is. Let me defer answering that in a detailed way, but the short answer is yes.
Okay, good. That's enough. Short answer is enough. Okay.
So this subject, the key word for this kind of thing, and there's an extensive literature on this, is optimal transport. And this is also called a transport plan. And one of the kinds of things we'll see, and let me just say this, I don't know exactly when this will come back. You can ask questions like, there's a law of large numbers. If I take finite samples in the empirical measure, that converges in the Wasserstein distance to any underlying measure. And you can ask, how fast does it converge, right? You might want rates. You always want rates. And the answer is the rate is proportional to something like the intrinsic dimension. If you have a notion of dimension, the rate depends on the dimension. And this is the sort of first taste of the ways in which this is related to geometry. Okay, and in fact, there's a nice paper, the names of the authors of which I'm forgetting, that estimates the dimension of a manifold by looking at the empirical convergence rate. And that's kind of a neat thing to do. Okay, so here's a picture. You're moving these, you're sort of moving this mass over and down, And these numbers, one thing to say about this, and maybe this is something I should have said sooner, we do not care about the numbers that come out of this. I tell you the Wasserstein distance is 6. What are you going to do with that? What you care about is the matching. And in the applications, you care about the matching. OK, so from a probabilistic perspective, what does this do? This is metrizing weak convergence. So there are lots of ways for probabilistic quantities, for distributions to converge. This measures one that I think is sensible for data analysis, which is that for any random variable, so for any way we're going to probe the distribution, the expectations converge. And again, I'm kind of lying, because in order for this to be true, I think you might have to have bounded diameter or something like there are hypotheses which I'm eliding. But for our purposes, this converges. And what's happening is this is sort of a reflection, again, of this law of large numbers, where if I start sampling from this thing and I get something like this, as I have more and more points, this is going to converge in the Wasserstein metric to this. OK? And that's, again, a sanity check. OK. So now you can extend this to comparing different metric measure spaces. This is the Gromov-Wasserstein distance. And one way to do it, and I guess I didn't write the formula for this, is you can just take the inf over all isometric embeddings, once again, and take the Wasserstein distance. But it turns out there's an explicit formula where you take the inf over all couplings of mu x and mu y and do this integral. And this should remind you very much of the expression for the Gromov-Hausdorff distance, because this is the same kind of quantity that you're integrating. And if you stare at this, it should already sort of be clear if this is some kind of relaxation of the Gromov-Hausdorff distance. OK? And so this, it turns out this is a metric. One thing that I do not understand, if someone does, I'd love to hear about it, is normally when you relax things, they don't stay metrics. And so the fact that this relaxation is still a metric is kind of cool. And I sort of wonder if there's a reason for that other than an accident. But anyway, I have nothing particular to say about that other than it's a very small puzzle. So here is the sort of more explicit way you can think of this as a relaxation, or we're building towards the program. So this one, we have a deterministic matching. We have the inf of the distortion. Here, we have a probabilistic matching, and we have the inf of the integral of something like the distortion. But you should think of this as some kind of fuzzy matching. And here now is the actual picture. So here's the integer program. The point is this. If you think about this quantity that we're measuring in the distortion, once you fix x and y, that's a constant. And the only thing you're changing is the relation. And that's a table of ones and zeros. And so that's an integer program. Now, you can relax it, and we get some kind of non-convex quadratic program. This is not good. I mean, let me be clear. It's good in the sense that this is more tractable than this. Quadratic programs are still hard to solve. Right? This is not actually a practical way to solve this. But it's better. We're moving in the direction of something we can solve. And I'll say something shortly about how we actually can do it. So again, this is just,
Can I ask you,
yeah.
So if I were to look at the Gromov-Hausdorff distance between the n sphere, okay, right, very high dimensional data, and its equator, right? I'm curious to know the dimensionality, right? So that's going to be whatever it is, something related to pi, presumably.
Yeah.
Right? If I were looking at the Gromov-Wasserstein distance, right, that goes to 0 at some rate because of concentration of measure.
So I'm going to say something about concentration of measure. But yes, so you are, one thing to say generically is that the usual things about concentration of measure that mean you're kind of busted when doing any sort of IID sampling-based geometric data analysis in dimensions over 8 afflict you here. And you can see it.
Right, but it's telling you, so don't worry. Gromov-Wasserstein is the best you can hope for.
That's right. Yeah, that's a really good point. That's right. This is telling you that that's what there is. That's right. Okay. So the way you actually do this is the following, and this is an idea due to Couturi and people who around him, which is that we're going to add a further relaxation where, and this is called entropic regularization, where we have the KL divergence of our coupling with respect to what you would think of as the uninformative coupling. And let me say a little bit about the uninformative coupling. So the simplest coupling, if I have mu1 and mu2, the simplest coupling I can give is to multiply them. Now, if you think about it, when do you multiply random variables? When they're independent. So this is saying, a good coupling says I can predict things about mu1 from mu2, right? It's some kind of betting thing. But this just says, there's no relation between them. So we're going to look at the entropy. This is essentially like a relative entropy, right, of our coupling with respect to the uninformative coupling. And then we have an epsilon scaling. So we've changed our loss function to have this epsilon. If this is 0, this is just the Wasserstein or Gromov-Wasserstein distance. If this is very large, we force this coupling to be the uninformative coupling. And what we hope is that there's some epsilon in between where we can compute and where it's close to what we care about. The answer is pretty good. And this isn't a crazy thing to do, because the idea here, the insight is that the thing that makes this optimization problem hard is that the coupling can be crazy, right? It can have some like tiny little detailed features that if you move around, if you perturb, it suddenly changes a lot. And so smoothing the coupling is going to make the optimization problem easier. That's the idea. And indeed, it turns out that you can solve this using what's called sinkhorn alternation, where you sort of, fix one part and then the other and then the other and then the other, and you seesaw. And this is convex. And so we can really do this. And so this works. There are standard Python libraries for this. You can do this for thousands of points. You can't do this for hundreds of thousands of points, at least with any reasonable epsilon, but you can do it for thousands of points. So this is actually practical. This is, by the way, again, it is not easy to see that this is true, that this is convex when you do this. It is, but that takes some work. OK, and so now let me sort of wrap up this talk with some discussion about some places this is turned up in the genomics literature. So maybe the real lesson I want to say is that optimal transport is generalized matching. And this, unlike some things in the geometric data analysis literature, this has actually had like real extensive use in genomics, which I think is good. So one kind of thing that people try with it is solving an alignment problem. You have RNA-seq and attack-seq data. You want to line that up. So you do some kind of dimensionality reduction, which I'm not going to describe, and then you use the Wasserstein distance to match them. And that turns out to be a reasonably good thing to do. And it's nice because, of course, you don't need any anchor points or any sort of priors about where things go. You just do it. And it turns out well. And there's a nice paper called Scott that does this. Another thing, I think I said something earlier about trajectory inference. So there's this beautiful paper by Schiebinger and a bunch of people, I think at Whitehead or Broad or something, where they look at fetal mouse neural tissue. And they hit it so that it starts differentiating. And then they measure, they take sequencing data every 12 hours or something like this. And they do this for 18 days, so they get 36 or 37 data points. And you want to look at the developmental trajectory. But of course, it's not so easy because every time you measure, you kill the cells. So what they do is they use a variant kind of optimal transport. And if you think about this, and I'll say nothing about this, but it's kind of cool because here, the cells are dividing, so the masses are changing. So you have to worry about some kind of, I was pretending earlier that the mass didn't change, but here you need to use some kind of unbalanced thing, what's called unbalanced optimal transport, and that has different, it's a little bit harder. But they do this, and you can get these cool trajectories you can recover. And of course, we know something about how these things are supposed to develop, and this turns out to be a reasonably good way to do it. So these are two things. And one thing that I worked on that I like, which I'll advertise, or my graduate students really worked on, which I'll advertise, is that you can do cell type annotation transfer across species, across age, across disease states, all sorts of things, where you essentially use the Wasserstein distance to produce some kind of graph on clusterings, and then find an optimal match using some kind of integer program. This is an integer program, though, we can solve because it turns out to be relatively small. And it turns out this is a really great way of transferring cell type information. And more interesting, I think, from a conceptual standpoint, if you want to transfer cell type information, I think this is a good way to do it. There are lots of ways to do that, but I think this is a nice one. But more interestingly, it says something cool, which is that the fact that optimal transport works to do this says that in some sense, a lot of what we mean by cell type is probability distribution in genomic space. That's what it tells you. And one kind of justification is one interesting thing we did with this was there's a nice paper called Saturn, which does stuff like this. And Saturn uses protein embedding data. And the results that come out of just doing optimal transport on the distributions is essentially identical to what you do if you use all this additional protein data. And and they do this on, we did this on like transferring like monkeys to zebrafish or so, or frogs to zebras, something where the species boundaries are pretty far. And again, it really, I think, highlights that what you meant there was distribution. Anyway, that's the end of this talk. So if you have questions, you should ask them. I will, return in 20 minutes to say something about manifold learning and actually connect it a little bit to some optimal transport applications.